Heather, if you could advance the slide. So we're using Zoom today. I'm sure everyone is familiar with Zoom. You love it or you hate it, or some days you love it, some days you hate it. Today the chat feature is enabled. So as the speakers are talking, feel free to provide your own commentary or thoughts in the chat. The speakers won't be responding to the chat, but we encourage the audience to utilize it. We're not going to be using the raise hand feature today, I don't think, but they will be taking questions at the end. So there's a Q&A feature. You can put in your questions at any time you like, and then we will run through them when the formal presentation is done. Next slide. A few announcements. So June 6th is the application deadline for the municipal certification program, and June 21 is the deadline to submit the third and final round of material for those schools that are seeking certification in the schools program. We have free technical assistance for one community. There's an application out to develop a water story, which is our shiny new action to deal with water sustainability. And it's the seminal required action for achieving the gold star in water, which is also being announced and released at the summit. And the session where you can hear more about that is being held on 5/18. And there is a $75,000 pool in grants for resiliency and environmental stewardship projects that is open now, that is funded by Atlantic City Electric and for those municipalities in their service territory. And you can find out about all of that on our website at sustainablejersey.com. So today, as I mentioned, we have two very special guests, and they're with the organization Sea Change Conversations, which is an all-volunteer, not-for-profit with headquarters in Princeton, New Jersey. And although they're headquartered in Princeton, they have a much larger national and global footprint in terms of their impact. And they in particular specialize, there's a prepared intro which I'll read, but I want to speak extemporaneously a little bit about this because it's important. They really specialize in couching the message about climate change to people that are skeptical. Unfortunately, the issue's become heavily politicized. People's opinions about it often reflect their politics or kind of almost tribal attitudes. And I think as people who care about sustainability and are in the sustainability movement, it's really incumbent on us to learn to speak with people that disagree with us. I think everyone's familiar with the term preaching to the choir. And the idea is that, yes, preaching to the choir is fun, and you get a lot of amens and hallelujahs, and it can be inspiring, but it doesn't expand the circle of believers. And so you need to preach and you need to talk to people that don't believe with you. So Sea Change focuses on that. One of their offerings is the Sea Change Primer, and this is a nonpartisan educational piece on the science and impacts of climate change. The primer's been presented to community organizations, businesses, professional associations, international and national businesses, churches, schools, colleges in 30 different states, reaching over 15,000 people. Their aim is twofold. First, to directly reach and educate people who don't think climate change is a significant threat. And secondly, to give those who are already concerned the scientific knowledge and language to talk about the issue with some mastery and to influence others. Sea Change Conversations has had great success, especially among conservative leading audiences in red states, and success in helping others understand the scale, scope, and urgency of the risk. Sea Change Conversations has also presented to many New Jersey Green teams in the past, including a community-wide event at Ocean City Free Public Library, organized by the one and only Ralph Cooper, the chair of the Upper Township Green Team, I believe. And that event was televised, and mayors and other local officials attended. Most recently, they presented to the Commonwealth Bank in Australia, reaching 200 of their employees throughout Asia, Europe, New Zealand, Australia, and America. Sea Change is not affiliated with any other group or business, and all of their support comes from community and audience members who value their nonpartisan outreach. Their growth has similarly been through grassroots support. audience members who recommend them to others around the country. So if you like what you see, they could use your love. Our two presenters today are Dallas Hetherington, a retired professional in global specialty chemicals, and Kathleen Biggins, the president and founder of the organization. And with that, I would like to, who's our first speaker? I forget if it's Kathleen or Dallas. It's Dallas. So with that, Dallas, I'd like to turn it over to you to begin the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Randall. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So, really glad to be here. Whenever we hold a conversation, let's see, I want to make sure you can see. Can you see my screen? Are you seeing the slide? One, we reached 417.12 parts per million. Scientists say if we continue on our current emissions path, we could reach almost 1,000 parts per million by the end of this century. We also know that carbon dioxide can last in the atmosphere for over 1,000 years. And because we know that as carbon dioxide increases, temperature also rises, it means that the carbon we put out today is going to impact future generations as far out as we can imagine. So let's move to the second question in our presentation. How do we know that it's us? Well, we know we're putting carbon dioxide in the air by burning fossil fuels. In fact, we've got 43% more CO2 in the air than at pre-industrial times. And we know that adding greenhouse gases into the atmosphere will warm the planet up. But how much is nature doing versus man? It turns out the CO2 molecules produced by burning fossil fuels have a different chemical fingerprint. So scientists can determine which ones were put up into the atmosphere by human activities and which ones are there through natural occurrences. Also, scientists cannot explain what they are observing without factoring in our influence. When they put into the climate models the many things that naturally occur to influence the climate, such as the Earth's orbit, its tilt and wobble, and solar activity, and the reflectivity we talked about before, and volcanic activity, they get this blue line on this chart, which shows that we would actually be in a very slight cooling period right now. But when you add in our activity on top of natural occurrences, you get this bright green line. And look how closely it approximates the orange line, which is what's actually happened. And given that we would be in a slight cooling period, this strongly suggests that 100% of the warming is due to human activity. Okay, let's move to question number 3. What do scientists think? And this is a really important question because only about 20% of Americans understand how strong the consensus really is. NASA says 97% or more of climate scientists say climate change is happening and that humans are influencing it. And this is a global consensus. The National Academies of Science in 80 different nations are saying the same thing. We also looked at the website of all these major scientific organizations, and it was unanimous. Climate change is happening, it's human influenced, and poses risks ahead. If you want even more confirmation, take a look at what ExxonMobil or Shell or other fossil fuel companies are saying. And even the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, founded by the CEOs of the top oil companies, says it endorses the Paris climate goals and agrees there is urgency to address climate change. So if the CEOs of ExxonMobil and Chevron and BP and Saudi Aramco and Shell all agree that this is happening and poses an urgent threat, what is everybody arguing about? I'd like to ask you to think about how you evaluate risk in your lives. If you're like most of us, you divide it into maybe 3 parts. The first part is, how likely is it to happen? Well, we've just heard that 97% of climate scientists say it is happening, and we just saw the Arctic melting away. So I think we can check that first box. Yes, we know it's happening. The second part of the risk assessment is, what are the consequences if it comes to pass? And do I want to live with those consequences, or are they something that I should try to avoid, maybe even at all costs? The third part of assessing risk is how difficult or expensive could it be to avoid the risk? Do you agree with that? Does that make sense? Then what I'd like to do now is take us into the fourth part of the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen Biggins, our founder, to take us to the end. I'll start sharing.
Can you see my slides? Good. Wonderful. Thank you, Dallas. So as Dallas mentioned, we are really faced with making a decision on how to evaluate this risk. And the second part of that risk proposition that is, how dire are the consequences, and can we indeed feel comfortable living with them if they come to pass? So let's drill down on how we could analyze that and answer that question. And to do so, we need to move to the next slide. And I believe that this is the most important slide in the entire presentation, because for me, it shows the big picture. On the bottom, we have time going back 20,000 years. And on the y-axis, we have temperature in Fahrenheit from about 9 degrees colder to about 11 degrees hotter. The gold line is average global temperature, and the white are kind of milestones for us to have for reference points. So 20,000 years ago, we were in the middle of a glacial period of the Ice Age, right? There were ice glaciers almost over the top part of North America. In fact, over Manhattan, there was a mile of ice, and much of the world was uninhabitable. In fact, the southernmost glacier ended right at exit 9 in New Brunswick. So even our own state was much less habitable. And then over about 7,000 to 8,000 years, nature moderated the average temperature, and it came up to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is kind of a sweet spot for our species and for our productivity. And it's a temperature that the Earth hasn't been at very often in its long history. And when we hit that average temperature of around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, we had the emergence of agriculture. We were able to create civilizations. And then as you go along that gold line, you see that little bump. That was the medieval warming period when the Vikings were actually able to grow vegetables in Greenland. And then you see that little divot, which is maybe 1.5 degrees, which was the Ice Age, which caused great deprivation as the glaciers came down. In fact, during that period, you could walk from Manhattan to Staten Island. And it caused food shortages, it caused upheaval, again, showing how a small change in global temperature makes for a big change on how we experience life on the planet. And then you see the temperature going up and away, landing somewhere between 3.6 and 10.8 degrees Fahrenheit at the end of this century, in large part dependent on what we choose to do. So let's think about that. We had about 7,000 or 8,000 years to move from those colder temperatures to that 60-degree mark. And along that time, nature had time to literally march trees from Mexico to Montana and to create the ecosystems and the biodiversity that has supported us for the last 10,000 years. And now, man, through our activities, are potentially triggering a similar delta in 100 years. And that is frightening. And that is what pulled all of the countries of the world together to say, hey, we can't go there. We can't go to those high numbers. We have to stay at the 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which correlates to like a 2 degrees Celsius, or even better at a 1.5 degrees Celsius, because at those levels, we think we can mitigate what's coming and adapt. But above that, we aren't so sure. So let's drill down on those changes that are coming because of climate change. But as we do so, I'd like you to look through the 3 specific lenses as we evaluate them. And these lenses are, how will these changes impact the jobs and economy in your area? How will it impact your and your family's health and personal security? And how will it impact your exposure to geopolitical instability, which we recognize as exposure to civil conflict, refugee crisis, and terrorism. Now, take a minute to think about why I'm asking you to look through those specific lenses. It's because those three things are what Americans report are the most important things to them when they go to vote. And we believe that climate change will profoundly and negatively impact all three. So let's see if you agree. Let's move quickly to temperature. This graphic from NASA shows how average global temperature has changed from pre-industrial times to today. You can see the numbers down at the bottom. When it is blue, it is colder than average, white is average, yellow is warmer, and red is hotter. So as you can see at the end, the red really comes crescendoing in. And that's because we aren't just breaking records, we're really shattering them, as you can see from this graph right here. In fact, the last years from 2005 have contained the 10 hottest years ever recorded. And 2020 tied with 2016 as the hottest year on record. But let's look forward. Let's see what's ahead of us for those of us that live in the New York region. According to Climate Central, which is a nonpartisan scientific group, they took 26 different climate models and projected what our temperature could be like if we continue on our current emissions path. And you can see that they project that our grandkids would experience summers that would be about 9.5 degrees hotter and feel like a summer in southern Florida today. But heat isn't the only thing we need to worry about. We also need to worry about humidity. We all know that humidity makes heat much more deadly. Climate Central took a look at that as well, looking at how many danger days, which are days when the heat index of heat and humidity feels like above 105 degrees. And that's when our bodies become compromised because it's much harder for us to sweat and keep ourselves safe. And you can see that we don't have a lot of those danger days in the New York region right now. But as you look at the projection, you can see by mid-century, we could very well have almost a full month of days where it will be dangerous to be outside for recreation or for work. Lost days. And it's even more grim as we look further south to some of our favorite cities who are projected to have several months of danger days coming up just in about 15 years and many more days as we progress into, the rest of the century. You guys, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see your heat index slide, the blue slide.
Okay. My computer flipped to a different screen. Okay, I'm with you now. It's gonna be hard to do it without being able to see the slides, that's for sure. Okay, so Orlando and my hometown of New Orleans are two of these markets that are going to be faced with these hotter, more humid days. So let's take a moment to think about those three lenses that we talked about. What do you think will happen to jobs and the economy in these markets when several months of the year it'll be dangerous to be outside for much of the day? Well, clearly we know that productivity goes down as heat goes up. We know that agricultural yield goes down as heat goes up. We know that these cities will have to build more infrastructure to keep their population safe. And we know that infrastructure tends to degrade more quickly, often in higher heat. So clear hits to jobs and economy. What about that second one, health and personal security? Well, we know that increased temperatures or increased heat exacerbates heart and lung disease. We may know that as heat goes up, crime levels go up. But what we may not know is heat and heat waves is the #1 weather killer, more than any other weather occurrence. So clear hits to health and personal security. But what about that third one? What do scientists mean when they say that these changes could lead to greater exposure to geopolitical instability. Well, as hot and humid as it may be in parts of the southern states in our country, it's anticipated that it's going to be hotter and more humid further south, and that parts of Central America could become much less habitable, and that many of those people will be forced to migrate to try to find a safer place to live. And that could lead to refugee flows unlike anything that America has experienced before. And of course, heat isn't just in our country, it's also increasing in some of the hottest areas of the world, like North Africa and the Middle East. This graphic from NASA shows a projection of what temperatures could be like at the end of the century if we continue on our current missions path. And what it shows is that the average temperatures could be above 113 degrees Fahrenheit in some of these areas, which really means that the Earth never gets to cool down, which is so critical for the health of many species. And importantly, if you think about what happened during the Syrian refugee crisis, when 5 million people were displaced by civil war and caused such disruption in northern countries, imagine what sort of migrations and refugee flows Europe would face if big swaths of North Africa and the Middle East are no longer as habitable as they are today. So clear stressors ahead. And I know that sounds far off, but there was a study in Nature just last year that showed that already for tiny bits of time in places like India and Pakistan and even the Gulf states of our country, we are hitting temperatures above what a healthy human being can survive. And it's the first time humans have faced heat thresholds at this level. And it is projected in the next 10 years that we may have heat waves of many days with this type of temperature in some of these countries. So this threat of heat is coming much more quickly than many of the scientists had thought it would. Let's move quickly to food. This is from the World Resource Institute. And what you see in red shows yield decline, and green shows increase in yield. And this is set at a 3 degrees Celsius or a 5.4 degree Fahrenheit increase. And what we see is really the population centers began to lose their ability to have the same sort of food productivity we've experienced in the past. And it's critical because many of the world's bread baskets will be under much greater pressure as we hit mid-century, and scientists are concerned that will lead to greater incidence of world famine. But food isn't just on land, it's also in the sea. Take a look at these cute little sea butterflies. These are at the base of the marine food chain. And the reason we're showing them here is because they are being influenced by the acidity in the water today. Because when carbon dioxide mixes with seawater, it turns into carbonic acid. And our seas are about 30% more acidic than they were before the Industrial Revolution. And creatures like these, but also creatures like scallops and clams and shrimp that we love to eat, are all being compromised because they can't build the calcium shells the way they could in less acidic waters. And we're not just acidifying the oceans, we're also heating it up in some areas up to 4 degrees hotter Fahrenheit. And that's critical because it's changing the patterns of our hurricanes and causing them often to be more intense and to be stronger further away from the equator, which means that they can create more damage in areas that historically they have not. And as we are heating up and acidifying the ocean, this is leading to dangerous bleaching of our coral reefs. And this is critically important because coral reefs are the nurseries of 25% of our sea life. And if we lose them, then clearly we will hamper future generations' ability to feed themselves from the sea. And this is when I'd like to call your attention to something that Dallas said up front, which is that small numbers matter. The most recent International Panel of Climate Change report showed that if we could keep our temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we could potentially save 10 to 30% of our coral reefs. But if we go all the way up to that 2 degrees increase, we will probably lose them all. So every smidgen of degree of heat increase matters, and every smidgen is worth fighting for. So let's move quickly to extreme precipitation. I'm sure this picture looks familiar to you because we are seeing these types of pictures from heavy rainstorms all across the planet. And that's because they are happening more often. And the reason they're happening is simply physics. Warmer air holds more water vapor. So for every degree warmer, the temperature goes up, the air can hold 7% more vapor, which means there's more water to come crashing down on our heads in these heavy precipitation events, causing all sorts of havoc. And while we may have too much rain, we're having too little snow. In fact, our precipitation is falling more as rain later in the year. Our snowpacks tend to be a bit smaller and are melting too early in the spring. And that is depriving streams and rivers, and of course, farmers and cities downstream from having the water they need during the hot growing season. We need to touch quickly on sea level rise. Obviously, our state is a coastal one. Sea level rise is kind of a terribly expensive and terribly insidious problem because we know we've baked in a lot of increase, but we don't know how fast it's going to come. Why have we baked it in? Well, because we know that those glaciers are melting on land and that land ice is flowing to the sea and that we're warming the oceans up and they are thermally expanding. We've had about 9 inches of sea level rise since 1900, and it's projected that we will have, on best case scenario, 1.5 to 3 feet, or worst case scenario, as much as 8 feet by the end of this century. And again, thinking about what kind of damage we're seeing just at that 9-inch increase, it's significant. Take a look up and down our coastline and see climate change in action with your own eyes. Imagine what the damage could be at higher levels. We took a look at a non-green resource to see what the economic cost could be. And so we took a look at what Zillow, a real estate expert, is projecting at a 6-foot increase in sea level rise. And you can see they are thinking that the United States would have about $1.3 trillion of land underwater if we continue on our current emissions path, with, of course, Florida, New York, and New Jersey having the greatest exposure. But importantly, these numbers belie the real scope of the risk because it doesn't include the infrastructure that is also going to be compromised. Our roads, our bridges, our railroads, our airports, even our fiber optics all hug our coastline. So the numbers are really so high, it's hard to really grapple with. Let's move quickly to health. The CDC has a very vibrant site on how climate change will impact your health. I recommend it to you, but there are a couple of things on it that surprised us, so we thought we would flag them for you. One of the things that climate change is exacerbating are levels of asthma. It's already happening today, and it's projected to get much worse in the future because one of the greatest triggers of climate change, pollen, are increasing dramatically. And this means that many more of us will be impacted with asthma and that there will be greater hits to our public health budgets. Another thing that is being exacerbated is the length of the wildfire season. While forest management plays a crucial role and it's an important strategy as we move forward, it is critical that we recognize that as our summer-like conditions extend through the year, it's tinder dry. And so when a spark happens, it means that it is more deadly and often more expensive, and in some cases more frequent. So a clear direct correlation between wildfires and climate change. Another direct correlation is the number of diseases that we are seeing spread by pests like fleas and mosquitoes and ticks, because they too are extending their geographical footprint and extending the time of in the year that they are active. And that is reflected by the fact that the CDC has said that illnesses from these insects have tripled since 2004. And the CDC also says that they anticipate that climate change will cause mass population movement and international conflict. Why? Because when we put pressures like the ones we've just outlined to you on places with poor institutions and weak governance, it can lead to chaos. And it's not just the CDC who has said so. It's actually our own national security, which in a report to Congress wrote, climate change is an urgent and growing threat to our nation's security, contributing to increased natural disasters, refugee flows, and conflicts over basic resources such as food and water. And another thing that is increasing is the number of natural disasters. This is directly from Munich Re, the leading reinsurance company of the world, and it shows how climate change, again, is exacerbating the number of natural disasters that we are facing. And one thing that is not going to go up, but in fact will decline, is our GDP. This is directly from BlackRock Investment, taking a look at local GDPs and how they will be impacted in climate change around mid-century. And you can see there is very little green on this map where the GDP is anticipated to go up. In fact, in many areas, we expect significant losses. And another area that we need to focus on is the fact that we are losing so much biodiversity and our ecosystems are being damaged. I'm sure many on this call may be birders. You may know that the Audubon Society has said that 2/3 of all North American birds are threatened by climate change. But it's not just our animals, it's also our plants. This is a reservoir near me where I love to walk my dog on a fall day. If I ever get grandkids, I hope to bring my grandchild there to enjoy the beautiful fall splendor. But scientists say that when my grandchild grows up, some of the splendor will no longer be in Princeton because it needs the cold to flourish. It's moving north. And this is happening all around the world where we are losing our sacred spaces. And I don't really know how to put a price tag on that, but for me, it's really priceless. So let's take a minute to think about what I just shared with you. I shared with you some projections from groups like NASA and NOAA, who we normally look to keep us safe. But does that mean those projections are spot on? Of course not. They are just projections, and so much of it is based on what we choose to do. But the question isn't whether they're 100% spot on. The question is, are these projections credible? And anywhere else in our lives, when we have a credible risk and the consequences are as dire as what we have outlined, we take action to avoid that risk. So think about your own home. I'm sure you have fire insurance. Is that because you are 100% sure your house is going to burn down? No, but because if it does so, it is catastrophic. And so you buy smart appliances, you shut your fire doors, you take precautions to avoid that risk. Scientists say that the chance of all of us on this call being impacted by climate change are much greater than of our house burning down. And yet we are not according it the proper respect. We are not really evaluating this risk the way we need to. Now, I know there are pundits out there who say, hey, don't get alarmed. Those projections, those models are overstating the risk. But what those pundits aren't telling you are about the scientists on the other side who say, hey, this actually is much more dangerous than what our models show because the models don't capture the black swan events, things that are less likely to happen, but if they do so are truly catastrophic. Like what? Well, like the melting of the Arctic permafrost. We all know that some of the critters up in the Arctic, when they die, freeze before they fully have a chance to decay. But now the Arctic is warming faster than any other part of the planet, and those frozen organisms are decaying en masse, and they're putting up carbon dioxide and methane at very high levels. And scientists are worried that we could create a feedback loop that humans could never control. So we have those on one side saying, hey, don't worry, be happy. We have some on the other side saying, hey, drink heavily, the Titanic is going down. And we have the vast majority of scientists in the middle who are saying this is a real and credible threat, and there are smart things that we can do together to lessen the threat. And all of us are supposed to take a bet. And we're supposed to take a bet not just for ourselves, but for really everyone else on the planet today, and not just for our generation, but for future generations, our kids, our grandkids, and even our great-grandkids. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, how would a prudent person make that bet? Now, I can't see your faces on this call, but I am guessing that I depressed a lot of you. And so I am rapidly going to move into question number 5, which is there hope? Because Sea Change resoundingly believes that yes, there is hope. Why? Well, we believe there's hope because the economic equation around this issue has been turned on its head. We now know that the cost of inaction is much greater than the cost of action. Why? Because as taxpayers, we are paying for climate change right now in the increased cost and number of natural disasters, in the loss that we're getting from this increased heat, the loss of productivity. We know that these costs will continue to escalate and that taxpayers are going to have to continue to pay for it. And at the same time, the cost of moving to a low carbon economy and lowering our risk has dropped so dramatically. It makes sense to do so whether you believe in climate change or not. So what do I mean by that? Go ahead. I mean that the new technologies like wind and solar have dropped so quickly in their costs that they now are the cheapest new form of energy in the world. And that's on an unsubsidized apples to apples basis. In fact, if you look at this graphic from Lazard, you can see that solar and wind are at 40 and 41 and significantly undercut the cost of fossil fuels. And our own Department of Energy believes that we could decrease the cost by another half within this century. This is the cheapest utility energy that humans have ever had. And this is a game changer. And this is true in 2/3 of the world today and will be true everywhere in the world in the next few years. And what this means is using these new technologies as cornerstones, there are multiple ways that we can get to a net zero position in our country by 2050 without spending more than we are currently spending in our energy sector. I'm going to say that again. Research shows that we can get to a net zero position in 2050 without spending more and using these new technologies as cornerstones. And importantly, what it also means is that jobs are growing in these new technologies. In the power sector already, non-fossil fuel jobs overshine or take up a much bigger part than fossil fuel jobs. And critically, in these studies projecting how we get to net zero, it shows that jobs will grow in almost every single state. And that's a game changer. And what that means is that states and utilities all across the nation, in Illinois, in Colorado, in Georgia, are finding that because of the economics of the situation, they have to move towards renewables because it will save billions of dollars for their customers and because the companies that are driving their economies are demanding it. We also know that the energy transition is hitting our transportation sector, and it will soon be cheaper to own an electric vehicle than it will be to own a gas power vehicle. Why? Because batteries have dropped 90% in cost over the last decade. And really, if you think of what an electric vehicle is, it is a battery on wheels with very few parts to break, much easier to manufacture, and much cheaper to maintain. So again, on economics alone, we are going to see EVs take over the transportation sector. The second reason that there is hope is the fact that other countries are stepping forward to lead the way. It's not just on the United States' shoulders, as many believed in the past. More than 110 countries, including states and cities, have pledged to be carbon neutral by mid-century, and this represents 70% of the global GDP. But as you can see from this graphic, we are being lapped. In fact, Europe and China have been the leaders in this category and have stated that they want to be the leaders in the new low carbon economy. Europe has really taken the lead this year. They have predicted that they could be the first carbon neutral continent by 2050. And they are doing very progressive things. Many of the countries have said they will no longer prospect for future oil and gas. They will stop all exploration. Others are outlawing short-term flights, and others are outlawing combustion engines. So they are moving very forcefully in this direction. China is an interesting case. It has kind of been the poster child of the biggest emitter, and they are still building coal plants, and they are still dependent on coal for a lot of their economic development. But at the same time, about 2 decades ago, they said that they wanted to own the new technology for low carbon, and they have moved aggressively to really command and dominate those new technologies. And there is real fear that the United States could be left behind. They manufacture about 1/3 of all the wind turbines, 70% of all solar photovoltaics, and 3/4 of lithium batteries. So we need to be very aware that while they are the biggest polluter, they are also the dominant force and leading the way in the new technologies. And importantly, developing countries are also getting into the game. As you can see from this graphic, from the green bars, today, developing countries spend more on this new low carbon technology than developed countries do. And that's critical because we need them to leapfrog over fossil fuels directly to the clean energy, just as they leapfrogged over poles and wires in telecommunication directly to cellular. The third reason why we have hope is because financial institutions are leading the way. Just this last year, the Chamber of Commerce came out and said, inaction on climate change is not an option, that we need strong policies to get us there. And the Federal Reserve has said that climate change is a direct threat to our financial system. We also know that investors are pushing on the different entities and companies to make them transform more quickly. Larry Fink, who is the CEO of the largest investment company in the world, BlackRock, has said that climate change has become a defining factor in companies' long-term prospect and is causing a fundamental reshaping of business, and that he and his company will pressure companies to do the right thing. And companies are listening. They are not only decarbonizing their own supply chains, they are forcing others to do it and looking to help consumers who use their end products also decarbonize. The fourth reason why we're thinking that there's a lot of hope that we can come together and address this is that there's all sorts of new technology on the horizon, including things in energy efficiency, whether it's in lighting, on what we can do for our buildings, including things like modernizing and decarbonizing our grid. And I want to talk about this because this is one of the most important things that we can do. Our grid is like the old road system before we built highways. It's balkanized, it's fragmented, and it is just not up to modern technologies. We have to upgrade it. And when we do so, it just makes sense to do so in a way that enables us to integrate much more of this new low carbon energy production. There's a lot that we can also do with batteries, including putting batteries on our homes or using them in our electric cars that would enable the utility to actually borrow a little bit of energy from us when they needed it, instead of putting on a peaking plant and using fossil fuels. So it allows much more flexibility as we go forward, which will help us drive our emissions down. Once we have a clean grid, we need to electrify everything, not just cars, but buses and garbage trucks, and even our short airplanes, our short flight airplanes. And we have to electrify our homes, our cooking and our heating and our water heaters. But for the short term, we will need to use fossil fuels as we begin to make this transition. And to do so safely, we need to find a way to capture those emissions and put them somewhere safe. This is a program up in Iceland that takes companies' CO2 emissions and puts it under basalt rock, where it turns back into rock. And even more inventive is this direct air capture plant over in Switzerland that sucks the carbon dioxide out of the air and turns it into useful products, including putting carbonization in Coca-Cola's in a nearby factory. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk a bit about nuclear. Many scientists are saying that nuclear has a role to play because we need to have that type of energy that comes on when we need it to complement the renewables that are beginning to take a bigger part of the grid. The new nuclear is much safer, puts out much less waste. Much of it is modular and could actually even be put into an old fossil fuel plant. And other countries are really leading the way in this, but many, many scientists say that we will need to continue to invest in nuclear as we go forward. And excitingly, the energy of the sun, fusion, is now deemed finally in reach. This abundant, clean source of energy has always been just out of reach, but now because we've had such progress in materials and AI and lasers, the National Academies of Science have recommended that we build our first pilot plant by 2035. And that if this works and we can make it market scale, it will be a major game changer in the second half of the century. Green hydrogen is also taking off. This is hydrogen that splits water into a clean gas using clean energy. And it is very helpful in manufacturing and in long-term shipping and air flights. And thinking outside of the box, there's some fun inventions that are being toyed with, including solar roads. This was one that was built in France. It wasn't that successful, but as I told you, China is always trying to one-up everybody. And in China, they developed a road that will actually not only power nearby cities and towns, but also has little electrodes in it that will allow electric cars to self-charge as they ride over. And lastly, we have to remember that there is great power in nature. If we work with nature and regenerate our natural spaces and work in agriculture in ways that mimic nature more closely, scientists believe that we could absorb about 30% of the excess carbon. And we are less divided than many of us think. If you ask Americans if they believe that climate change is happening, 72% say yes. If you ask them, do they support regulating CO2, 75% say yes. And if you ask them, do they support renewable energy, 86% say yes. Which means that the politics around climate is finally changing. Republican leader Kevin McCarthy recently had said, we've got to do something better. Republicans have to show that we can solve this. And in part, this is because young Republicans care deeply. And for the first time, millennials and younger voters outnumber baby boomers. And because the economic equation is changing, especially at the state level, and we are seeing more bipartisan proposals at the federal level. And I think this was really a clear indicator when the youngest congressional Republican earlier this year said, Republicans can now love God, love guns, and hate greenhouse gases. And that's something that just would never have been said 5 years ago. But we're in a race, and right now we are at risk of losing that race. Our current projected path of emissions is still at that higher level, somewhere between 6 and 10 degrees Fahrenheit, most likely in the 5 to 6 areas as we begin to use less and less coal, but still significantly higher than where we are now. And if you think that at 7 degrees colder, we were in an ice age, we can imagine what that will feel like for our kids and our grandkids later in the century. And so we need to move off of that emissions path dramatically and quickly move to a zero carbon economy. How do we do that? Well, the first thing we need to do is demand more from ourselves, our communities, and our leaders. We need to begin to think about this every day, especially when we meet a young child in a stroller and ask his or her name, because we are looking at the face of someone who will be on this planet when she is playing by very different rules. And they're going to look at us and ask us, what did you do? The second thing is that we have to recognize that we were all in this together. We either sink or swim together. What we do will either help or harm others and vice versa. We also need to know that our new technologies and moving away from the status quo is what will save us, and we need to put our dollars into innovation and investment in the future. And we need to raise our voices with our policy leaders at the national, at the state, and at the local levels, and to companies, because companies are driving much of the change. And we know that if 100 people call a leader, it is a tsunami that they listen. So it doesn't take that many voices to really call attention that this is something you care passionately about. You need to talk to your friends and peers. It's the most important thing that we can do so that we can create the public will to enable the policies to be enacted that will save us. And we need to take personal action. What can we do? One thing is protect nature, protect the environment, plant more trees in your city and also in your own backyard. We need to lessen our own carbon footprints, look to get an energy audit on your house, see if you can buy renewable energy through your public utility. I know I can in Princeton and have. Look to use less plastic because they are very greenhouse gas intensive. And also consider eating more leftovers because much of our energy is used in our food system and about 40% of our food is wasted. So that is just a huge energy waste as well. And also consider moving towards a more plant-based diet because it has a much lower footprint. Consider an electric car. As I said, it's going to be cheaper and they are already so much more fun to drive. Definitely a better ride. So consider one of those or at least a hybrid or using transportation less often. And lastly, write checks. There are not-for-profits in this arena on the liberal side, in the middle, and the conservative side that are doing incredibly important work. Please, please support them. So how much do we use? Well, in the United States, per person uses about 4 times as much or emits 4 times as much carbon as others in the world. And some of the things that we can do to lower our footprint is looking to lower how much carbon we use, primarily in our housing and our travel, and of course, a bit in our food. And as you can see from the right-hand part of this, some of the biggest things we can do is to buy clean energy or put up solar. Secondarily, to buy a more efficient car. Thirdly, to think about a little less flying. And fourth, to think about a little less meat in our diet because red meat, again, is very carbon intensive. So in closing, I'd like to say we are the first generation to understand the risk of climate change. We are the first generation to begin to feel the brunt of it on our own shoulders. And we are the first generation to understand that we are leaving a very damaged and potentially dystopian world for our kids and our grandkids. And we are also the first generation to have the tools to do something about it. And the question for all of us on this call and all of us on this planet is what will we choose to do? Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Kathleen. That was awesome. Appreciate. We have some comments here in chat. Comment about the case for paralleling health risks, like doctors saying you have a 50% chance of dying from X, Y, or Z if you don't stop doing the things and start doing others. How would you or most people react? That question about tying health into the presentation.
So we actually are developing a primer just on health that we will be offering as a secondary primer to this one, because health is one of the most important triggers for people to think about this issue. And we also know that doctors are considered really trusted messengers. So what we're seeing is a lot of doctors are being encouraged to talk about climate change as in not so much referencing climate change, but in talking about how are you protecting your son, your grandchild in summer sports? Because as you know, the temperatures are increasing because of climate change. And so they're weaving it in, but making it a direct correlation to how that person is living their life and that they need to make a change and acknowledge climate change in order to stay safe. There are so many areas where climate change impacts our health because it really affects the underpinning of everything that we need to stay healthy, whether it's clean air, clean water, whether it's safe shelter, whether it's disease control. I think what the pandemic has shared with us that our health system is a bit more fragile than we recognized. And in fact, climate change will make our exposure to pandemics even greater because species are being dislocated because of climate change and we're coming in contact with them. So it's a wonderful question, and it's definitely, I think, a wonderful way to wake people up is to focus on that health portion. Dallas, did you have something that you want to add?
No, one thing I think I would add is we've seen a lot of studies that have been coming out about the health impacts of climate change, and they estimate that the premature deaths from climate change globally is somewhere, you get all kinds of numbers, but the numbers are somewhere in the range of, I think, 5 to 8 million a year, premature deaths from it. So it is a risk, and it's something that it'll be a big benefit once we've addressed climate change to reduce that number.
A question about, again, many compliments on your excellent presentations, Dallas and Kathleen. And I just want to add, we had Dallas and Kathleen participate in our Youth Climate Summit earlier and do this presentation because climate change education has now been passed as a requirement in all New Jersey K-12 schools. So we found this presentation very helpful for getting educators and parents a baseline understanding of some of the challenges and some of the things that will be introduced in the classroom as part of student learning standards starting in September 2022. So one question, what extent does Sea Change modify presentations to different audiences? In other words, what components of your, quote, meeting in a box changes based on whether you're presenting to a student group versus neighborhood or seniors? And how do you overcome like the overwhelming people when sharing this type of content in the day-to-day lives? Do you make time for breakouts or sharing or things like that? So maybe you could talk about how you've tailored this to different audiences in your travels.
Sure, Dallas, I'll start. So yes, we do tailor it. It depends. We as was noted, we just presented to an international bank where we were talking to people all around the world, which meant we had to say everything in Fahrenheit and everything in Celsius and kind of spread it out. So we definitely tailor it for different audiences. We also tailor some of those specific things like how hot it's going to be and how many danger days and other areas specifically to that market. We originally started going out to associations, and we found that what that enabled us to do is to get to audiences who would not self-select to listen to a climate change talk. So say you're invited to go to an investment club or a church or even a garden club, like Garden Club of America has embraced us quite a lot. And you go into their normal meeting and all of a sudden they wake up and they're like, oh, it's a climate change speaker today. And so you've nabbed these people that would never self-select to come in and hear about it. When we go to an association, our presentation is close to what you've seen here. We have a little bit more, if it's a gardening thing, a little bit more about gardening. If it's a business, a lot more on the risks to business. For schools, we've only done high school and up. I think it's a little bit disturbing for a younger audience. So you all as educators would have a better sense of that. So we definitely changed some of the content, but what we look to do is have them then take our information and discuss it within their association on how to take action or how they could influence others or what they are comfortable in doing. Again, because we're talking to a lot of skeptics along the way, we want to be very careful in what we prescribe, and we have to be very, very cognizant of the fact that there are ways to address this that are more amenable to conservative principles, and there are those that are more liberal, and we do not vote on that, and that's important in enabling us to reach these audiences. And that's also why you don't see a lot of social justice in this message, because again, this is to bring people who don't think it's a real issue along. Though in certain audiences, we've added that message in because it is critically important. So yes, we tailor and we can work with our hosts to make it specific to their association or market.
Thanks, Kathleen. I will add that there's a session tomorrow on the summit called Climate Interpreter, Best Practices for Talking About Climate Change. That's tomorrow at 3:30 as part of the Sustainability Summit. And this is from NOCI, the National Network of Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, where they will focus a little bit more on one-on-one engaging in public discourse. It's positive, civic-minded, and solutions-focused. And they have a whole training course beyond what they're going to talk about tomorrow that you might be interested in for those of you looking to talk about this more in your local and personal audiences. one other question here in the chat is, how do we deal with people that we come across that are like, climate change is just too far, we're too far gone at this point to be able to meaningfully impact it. And there's no point because there's so much carbon in the atmosphere, the temperatures will continue to rise regardless. The question is, how do you combat this mentality?
I guess I'll start. I think Kathleen is more experienced with this, many years more than I do. But one thing that I've learned in my short time, a year with Sea Change, is to start out by listening, to ask why people, if you have somebody in front of you who is saying that, to just address why, ask why they feel that way. What is driving that? What have they read, or who are they talking to? And, because once you have that, you can begin to turn the conversation to hope in that particular question, because there's a lot of reason for hope, right? We've talked about that today, and you may not want to take the attitude that you will turn them around, because it's very hard to change somebody's mind, particularly if they're invested in the position that it's not worth working on, or that they even don't believe it. You might run into that too. But at least you can listen and then respond with some of the facts that you've learned. Kathleen, what do you think?
I think I agree with you, Dallas. I think that frustrates me when I hear that attitude, because we are kind of in a race, right? We're racing against the changes in nature and our human ingenuity and the new technologies that we've created. And there's a lot of smart things that we can do. Yes, we have changed the earth. It'll never be exactly as what we inherited. But the difference between if we take action and we don't is existential. So anyone who says that to me is copping out and is being a coward, because we have the ability to change our trajectory. We have these new technologies, and we all need to put our shoulder to the wheel to get there. And if you believe in climate change and you take that attitude, then it to me is more upsetting than somebody who doesn't believe in climate change. We all have a responsibility to the world to try to protect it and to keep it for future generations. And I think most of us feel that way. And I think there's a lot to be hopeful for. And the economics are with us, and business is with us, and many of the rest of the world are with us. So I bop them around their head a little bit, as I think the answer.
Yeah, I think many of us feel similar. It is challenging. A question about concerns around environmental justice and how to communicate that within the context of climate change talks. How would you tailor this presentation to folks who are already bearing the brunt of exposure to environmental health risks?
Yeah, and it's a really big issue. I actually am sitting on a Women in Climate conference right now, which is really all about this topic that the Nature Conservancy put together. And it is so critical because they are already exposed. And it's intriguing for me because when we reached out to that audience early on, we heard back, you know what, we have so many other issues right now, climate change isn't on our radar. And now that we understand how it's already impacting them, it's definitely on their radar. And so the shift I've seen in the last 5 years since we started is remarkable. It is an interesting topic because clearly so many of these pressures harm people who have less ability to protect themselves because of their socioeconomic place and often where they live and being exposed to higher levels of pollution. And remember, climate change and pollution are often caused by the same things, but they are not the same thing. And it is also intriguing because when one factors in social justice, it can lead to different choices in policy versus if you just analyzed it on the economics or on some other thing. So it is a really critical discussion that's happening in this arena right now. And I think that it is played a really important role in helping people think about how climate change is happening now today instead of just being a future far off issue. So it's played a major role, I think, in elevating the issue. but it's complicated. It's not just black or white, or it's not clear. There's lots of interface between how it is impacting them, but also how it's impacting our choices on policy and what's the best way to go forward.
Thank you, Kathleen. And so I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their day to attend this presentation. It is recorded and it will be on the Sustainable Jersey website. We'll have a recording of all the summit sessions. In fact, along this this topic of environmental justice, there is a session following right after this at 11:30, but the registration is closed. It was they had a cap on their attendance because of the interactive nature of it, but it will be recorded. It's called Challenging Implicit Bias, Exploring the Way Forward, and you'll be able to check out that presentation as well as many other recordings if you weren't able to attend some sessions. So we would like to thank our underwriters for the Sustainability Summit, our sponsors who make it possible for us to do this as a nonprofit and share this work with you, our volunteers throughout the state. We also want to make you aware that there are some more things happening. We have a movie night where you can screen the movie in advance and participate in a discussion with us. We have some further sessions about our Sustainable Jersey for Schools initiatives. And again, those recordings will be available. I just want to thank Kathleen and Dallas once again for doing this presentation. This is the second time I've heard a variation on it. And each time I take away something different and I think about how I would use that knowledge to engage different people in my life to talk about climate change. And I appreciate you. And it's awesome that we have you right here in Princeton, in our state, as a resource. So after this presentation, you'll get a pop-up for a survey. And I encourage you to do that. We're going to share those results with Kathleen and Dallas. And if you'd like them to come and speak to your community or your group, please reach out to them. They have a fabulous website, Sea Change Conversations. So again, thank you everybody for your time and have a great day.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.